What we are here trying to do at Integral Spiritual Center is carry a certain kind of very, very important conversation forward by, in many ways, being really going where no particular kinds of conversations have gone before. We're really trying to explore things that haven't really been explored before. There's no question but that every major spiritual orientation since the dawn of humans has ended up doing this one way or another, because spirit, whatever else it is, appears to be frisky and continues to come up with new stuff, sometimes hourly, from my understanding. So what we want to try right now is a combination of two things. One is Genpo is going to start us down the road of big mind process. And for about 30, 40, 45 minutes, he's going to walk us through a sense of the finite selves, some of the important finite selves that he might choose to call forth this morning. And then, depending on when I finish talking, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction here about the second part of what we want to do, because I want to be able, for us to be able to just go right into that without me having to pause and try to set it up. So I'm going to give just a little overview of what we'll be going into. We're basically going to devote the next 2 hours or so to this experiment. And it is going to begin with Genpo basically attempting to get us all in touch with our finite selves. Most of us spend most of our time, of course, in touch with our infinite self. And so I've asked him to start and do it the other way in this case, and try to talk most of you out of contact with God and into contact with your egoic selves. So we will have an appropriate launch pad, and we can actually feel that we're making progress as we move into the second part of the experiment. Let me set it up by saying that one of the things that is a deeply perplexing issue is just not how much of spirit is present, but how much of our awareness of spirit is present and can be accessed. There are certain trained states, of course, states such as Nirvikalpa Samadhi, that by most accounts can take months or even years to learn how to train appropriately. There are other aspects of spirit and our awareness of it that seem to be indeed not only ever present for spirit on the spirit side, but either ever present or very close to ever present on the side of most human beings. One of the extraordinary things that Genpo Roshi has managed to do with Big Mind process is to take certain aspects of this spiritual awareness on the human side of the street and show that it is much more accessible than many people would have thought possible. And in particular, a certain type of experience known as Kensho, or a profound glimpse into one's ever-present non-dual condition, can be had in a much shorter amount of time than people thought previously possible. It's not uncommon for a Zen practitioner to spend 3 or 4 years in arduous Zen meditation before their first really strong Kensho. And now the shortest that Genpo has been able to do it so far is 53 minutes. And I take this to be progress on the path of humanity's spiritual self-understanding. What remains to be seen is just how much can be called forth. If we want to say, let me talk to the voice of Big Mind, let me talk to the voice of Big Heart, let me talk to the voice of ever-present spirit, there's a sense in which that does indeed seem to be relatively accessible. The traditions tend to, certainly Vedanta and Vajrayana, tend to refer to at least 5 major states. And these are waking, dreaming, deep sleep, turiya, or witnessing, and turiyatita, or non-dual awareness. We're not saying that non-duality itself is a state. That's an ever-present condition. It's just the first time an individual tends to flash on it. That flashing is often referred to as rigpa. That flash itself is initially a temporary state. So we sometimes count satori as a state. The understanding, that is its content, is an ever-present condition. So we want to, after Genpo begins and starts us through the Big Mind process, we are going to, at some point, about halfway into the overall 2-hour process, have him be joined by Rabbi Mark and Swami Sally and Maestro Fred, and we are going to experiment in what kinds of voices can we actually have access to. And this can be not only in terms of some of the spiritual or infinite voices, but also some of the voices in relation to what we ended up discussing yesterday, for example. You remember that Rabbi Mark talked about one soul print and a particular kind of shadow, using shadow in the very broadest sense, that could be referred to as soul print distortion. In some sense, losing touch with your soul print in a profound way. And he mentioned one of the 2 distinctions that integral psychology makes between what we call submergent or submerged shadow and an emergent unconscious, an emergent shadow. And I've drawn that just very briefly on this diagram right here. And we'll be referring to this later, particularly this afternoon. But one of the topics that people most wanted to discuss this afternoon when it comes to the theoria portion is indeed shadow. What does it mean? What is the first, second, and third person process with that? Does meditation help gain access to the shadow, or does it not? There are different types of shadow, and we will be going into that. But just to show you what one of the voices that we might be talking to in an hour or so, in addition to big mind, big heart, ever-present awareness, and some of the finite voices that Genpo will walk us through, is as Fred and Sally and Mark are here, I've used the notion of soul print shadow in the sense of how is the shadow related to soul print in terms of the submergent and the emergent unconscious. And let me just briefly show you what this is, because these are some of the kinds of things that we might be dealing with in the second half of the 2-hour presentation. Roughly, and this is a very, very schematic diagram, so of course take this very, very, very loosely. But you're all familiar, again, with generally the great shape in the being, even though we might interpret it in more post-metaphysical ways. But we have basically body, mind, soul, and spirit. And the traditions, almost without fail, refer to at least 2 movements, again using even movement very loosely, in relation to spirit. This is what is referred to often as involution, or the movement away from spirit into conditional spirit, soul, mind, and body. And then the return from body to mind to soul to spirit, which is referred to as evolution. Plotinus referred to this as efflux and reflux. And there is one of the primary distinctions that integral psychology made a long time ago, probably in the pre-trans fallacy, probably 20 years ago. I was the first to point out that there's a huge difference between that which is repressed during involution and that which is repressed during evolution and development. And that there is a big, big difference between if you are moving away from spirit and something is repressed or dissociated or lost touch with, which we're just going to call involutionary repression, losing touch with your soul print in a profound sense, versus what happens as you start to develop, and you might, in age 2 or 3 or 4, get some aspects of the relative self split off and repressed. And that's developmental repression. That's shadow that was once conscious and is submerged here. But that's different from something that, as Rabbi Marx said, the soul print is something you have prior to birth. However you wish to interpret birth. It can mean actually in the Bardo realms, and these are the 3 Bardo realms if you want to interpret it that way. It can mean moment to moment, moving away from spirit. Right now we habitually contract. That contraction in the face of ever-present open nature and ever-present transparency. That's involutionary movement, that's self-contraction movement. That involutionary repression is different from once you then are a finite self and you start your developmental move from body to mind to soul to spirit in a conscious way, having things being split off and repressed due to something that your mom did to you, or your dad did to you, or your dog did to you, or your spouse did to you. It's horrible. So that's submerged unconscious. I've drawn here, again just using this as just a general sort of what happens to you before you're born as a separate self, and then the developmental trajectory on the way back to fully self-conscious self-realization. Somebody who's about, let's say, a young adult, and their center of gravity is represented by this green line, and they are basically, body has now become conscious, most of mind is conscious, and they're moving back into higher soul and spirit realms, meaning as a fully realized capacity. Anything that was conscious during the early years and has been sealed out, that's the submerged unconscious. And it's usually, there's a repressed form of that, there's dissociative forms of that. We don't need to get into those details. But these are the components that in particular we work with on the 3-2-1 process. We're trying to get in touch with these components because they're the ones that can really wreak havoc with higher development. Higher structures that have not yet emerged are referred to as the emergent unconscious. They're not yet repressed, they just haven't had a chance to emerge yet. So if you're right around here, and let's say that your center of gravity is orange, then in the emergent unconscious, there's still green and teal and turquoise at the very least. Those haven't been repressed, but they are unconscious. They just have not yet had a chance to emerge yet in terms of their developmental unfolding. But if they remain unconscious beyond the time that they could emerge, then we talk about a repressed emergent. And one of the points that any sort of spiritual psychology has always wanted to try to understand is what's the relationship between if you have a soul print dissociation, if you somehow lost your soul, you're out of touch with your soul, not because of something mom and dad did to you, but because of some profound choice you have made in the very depth of your own being to deny your own spirituality. If there's a profound denial and contraction away from the very core and nature of your own spiritual being, what's the relation of that soul print dissociation and what happens with these other kinds of shadow elements? And I've in red, I've listed at least 3 different types of shadow components. And so we might want to be talking about those this afternoon, and I'll try to give you about 20 or 30 years of integral psychology and the related disciplines of transpersonal psychology have had to say about some of these types of relationships. They're very fascinating.